Hey everyone, welcome back to Portal of Wisdom. I'm back today with another story for you. So if you are new to the channel, like and subscribe and click that little post notification bell so you get alerted when I post new videos. And now on to today's topic. Today we are going to do a story that was suggested by one of my subscribers. It was suggested by P. Cox. And this is the story of the Tucson Crosses. This is one of those controversial type of stories, sort of like the Kensington Runestone or the Thoen Stone, both of which I've already done videos on my channel, and those are both very intriguing stories that have historical significance, but some people believe them, some people don't. Anyhow, have you ever heard of the Tucson Crosses? Most people haven't. Sometimes they're also called the Tucson Artifacts. So they are an interesting and intriguing set of over 30 lead crosses and artifacts, and they're engraved with Latin and Hebrew. So they were found near Tucson, Arizona in September of 1924, and they've been shrouded in controversy ever since, just like the Kensington Runestone and the Thoen Stone, like I mentioned. Look at those videos if you also like these kind of stories. So, the Tucson Crosses, what's so unusual about them, or controversial, is that they state that Romans were here in Arizona from 790 AD to around 900 AD. Pretty crazy, right? So, these Tucson Crosses and other relics, they're all engraved with Latin and Hebrew and tell various stories. And they basically tell a story of these Roman colonists that lived near Tucson for 100 years or a little longer. And the story that the crosses tell is why there's so much controversy. The inscriptions state that the Romans were here, like I said, from 790 to 900, and they took part in, I believe, a revolt by the Toltec people, which were in northern Mexico, and probably spilled into the Arizona area also. So these crosses, they were found by a gentleman named Charles Manier, and it was September 1924. It was near an abandoned lime kiln off Silver Bell Road, so this is northeast of Tucson, or kind of more east of Marana, Arizona, and right off of Silver Bell Road, which is still a very desolate gravel road. Some of it might be paved now, but years ago, even when I was there at a ghost town site off of Silver Bell Road, I believe all of Silver Bell Road was still just desert gravel. Anyhow, so I believe Charles was out in a outing in his Model T or some old car like that, and he found one cross sticking out of the ground, and it looked peculiar. It caught his attention, so he pulled over, and then he tried to dig it out to free it. And as he dug through the layers of this desert caliche that held it in place, he found there were more relics there. And caliche is this layer-like accumulation of calcium carbonate that is deposited in desert soils, and over a long time this layer can get pretty thick. It creates a thick cement-like layer that can be very difficult to dig through, especially in soils that have been undisturbed for centuries and, have this really thick layer of caliche. So caliche can at times be up to 3 feet thick or more in undisturbed soils, and this will factor in a little bit later. So as Charles dug out the large lead cross, he realized it was actually two pieces that were stuck together, and when he pried them apart, he found engraving on both of the faces of the crosses. So he wasn't sure really what to make of them at this point, so he inquired with a Latin professor at the University of Arizona, which is in Tucson, and this professor was able to translate them. So Charles went back to the location that he found them with his friend and business partner Thomas Bent. Also, who came along were some university faculty, including Dr. Frank Fowler, who had translated the crosses, and some other faculty, probably in the science or archaeology departments. So they went back to the location and they participated in excavations here. And they documented things very well, taking lots of photos. And the find appeared in newspapers in Tucson and Phoenix and even the New York Times. And I believe the pictures that they took, they still exist today, and there's loads of pictures. By March of 1930, a total of 30 relics had been uncovered at the site, some as deep as 5 feet deep. So through 5 feet of caliche. So they were all made of lead, except for one stone and one boulder, which had an R carved into their surface. And it was translated that these smaller stones were said to be memorial stones for their leader, Theodore, who was identified on one of the crosses. So we'll get into a little more of the translations in a minute, but as far as the lead that they were composed of, it was not highly refined, which you probably wouldn't expect it to be highly refined for, if they were actually made in the, 700s or 800s. So this lead was not highly refined. It was said that within it existed mixtures and a lot of traces of antimony, zinc, copper, tin, silver, and gold. So the University of Arizona researchers, they verified at the time that the lead composition did match closely from lead that had been pulled out of a mine that had been mined for, I don't believe they knew how long that there had been a mine there. But it's the old Yuma mine, and it was said to be about 5 to 10 miles away, so it wasn't too far away from the discovery site. So it seemed that at this point we knew the source of the lead, and now it was assumed that if they were going to be legit, that there would be a source of lead nearby, as lead would not be a material that would be taken across the ocean on ships. It just was not valuable like silver and gold. So many of the crosses were in pairs, but there were also several swords and other artifacts, and they didn't just have Latin and Hebrew on them. They also had symbols like spoons, tridents, menorahs, angels, temples, and various other symbols on them. Once they were brought to the Smithsonian, they were deemed immediately as fakes. And one of the people involved in this, calling them fakes, along with the Smithsonian, was a lawyer who had never even seen them, and he professed that they were fake and they were created by a practical joker who had then planted them in the soil for someone to find. He also said that the Arizona faculty should not have attached their names to the reports, so they must be looking for fame and notoriety. And he said that compromised the reports of the discovery and also was further proof that they were fake. So the crosses tell a story of a Toltec city named Rhoda, which these Romans conquered and expelled the king and captured 700 of the citizens. There were many leaders listed on the crosses, along with their ruling dates and details, and it included details like there were 2 factions that went to civil war with each other, killing up to 3,000 people. And they also mention on the crosses that there was an earthquake that happened in the year 895 AD. And I believe there is proof of that, in the geologic record. So another part of the translation said, "To the memory of Romans, Britain and Albion's Jacob, to the second Aetus, Theodore, and to Israel of the Seine province in Gaul, consuls of mighty cities with 700 soldiers, AD 800, January 1. We are transports on the sea. Callalus is terra incognita. The Toltec governor was a king ruling widely over the peoples. So that was one of the translations. There's a lot of different translations because there's so many things that these stones say, and just a huge amount of detail that can be obtained. After the artifacts were called fakes by the Smithsonian, really they were called fakes with little effort on their part to really determine if they were fake or not. But after that, the artifacts just sat and collected dust by the finding family until 1994. In 1994, they were brought by the Bent family to the Arizona Historical Society Museum, who then displayed them as curiosities. Then they started to get a second look in more modern times. One of the reasons that people believed that they were fakes was because one artifact seemed to show some kind of a dinosaur, possibly a lizard, maybe a dinosaur. And modern scholars now believe that this was actually something called a tannin, which was a symbol of international trade and ancient seafaring. So I believe in the 1920s, they thought this was supposed to be a dinosaur and that this just was more proof that it was fake. But this, of course, if this was what they called a tannin, this would make more sense since these were definitely seafaring type of people. Another thing people wondered about was why there was no smelter or foundry or rock forms or ruins nearby if these articles were made somewhere nearby. But then again, these artifacts were buried under a lot of, rubble and caliche and everything, so it could be that if there were some forms somewhere that they could just be buried, in the ground. And this is a totally undeveloped area still. And while looking into things in the 1920s, they found out that, they found the gentleman that had built this lime kiln in 1884. And he said when he was building the lime kiln, he found 2 lead swords that he then gave to his kids to play with. But of course, this is, something, 40 years later or something like that. So those swords had been lost to time by this point. He didn't know where they were anymore. So all of the stories and details mentioned, including dates on the artifacts, do match up with history. So there's a gentleman named Donald Yates, and he's done a ton of research and compiled a lot of data to put all these pieces of the puzzle together, stating that he believes that they are all authentic, and he has written phenomenal books on the subject. And he mentions that these lead artifacts even have dates for things that we know have happened around certain times, like a precise date for an earthquake or a colossal flood that may have factored into the downfall of the colony. I believe this colossal flood was around the year 900 AD. And a lot of this stuff, there is scientific evidence that these things happened around these times, and now we have precise dates for them because they're inscribed on the stones, and they do match up with close approximate times that have been believed that these things happened. But Donald Yates isn't the only one who has done all this research, and man, he's done a ton of great research, but there are others who have taken other approaches too. It is known that if the artifacts were in fact forgeries, that they would have been made a few short decades within their finding, if not much more recent than that. So it seemed that if the lime kiln builder found 2 lead swords that he let his kids play with in 1884, then if you believe what he said, and you still think that they're fakes, then they would have had to have been produced within 20 to 30 years of that date, because there really wasn't much for people coming into Arizona. Of course, you had the native people here, but there wasn't really hardly any people coming into Arizona much before the Civil War. So it was also said that the Papago and Pima native tribes had an oral tradition of white people coming hundreds of years before the Spanish conquistadors. And the Papago and Pima people, they lived in this exact area. Also, people that state that they are fake, they may cite Charles Manier's widow, Bessie. And she had a letter that she wrote to Mr. Bent's widow, and she stated that she found a letter written by Dr. Searle from, I believe, University of Arizona, and her husband, stating that they made the artifacts. But the letter was quickly tagged as a fake itself, since the cover letter by Bessie and the confession letter had identical handwriting, so it was obvious it was not written by anybody except for Bessie. And I believe this was in the early 70s, in the 1970s, so possibly she was sick of the attention on the family that came when the Smithsonian said they were obvious fakes, and maybe she wanted no part of it anymore at that point and wrote the letter. But anyhow, at that point, we knew the letter was a fake. Others state that there was supposed to be a forger in the area named Timoteo. And no one seemed to know who this person really was. And if he was making forgeries of things, then what was the purpose? Because no one ever profited from their finding, from the finding of the crosses. And why would someone forge more than one piece, let alone 30? Also, it would have required at least 150 pounds of lead, and it would have taken a heck of a lot of time for one person to pull off all of this. Just for a joke, what would be the real point? Would someone in the 1800s in desolate Arizona really do that? Also, how come none of this supposed forger Timoteo's other works have ever surfaced? If he was a supposedly, a known forger in the area, where are his other forgeries? And that's made a lot of people think that this was just another story to try to make up where these could have come from more recently. But due to all this controversy in more modern times, Scott Wolter, a forensic geologist, he got involved, and he wanted to see these artifacts, and he wanted to see if he could determine anything about their authenticity. And once he heard the story and he saw the artifacts, he knew that he needed to be able to see the discovery site, and he wanted to be able to see the desert caliche layer that they were found below, as he did believe that this could help unlock the truth. But he also wanted to evaluate the actual writings on the crosses, like the inscription of the AD DCCC on one of the crosses, which was denoting the year 800 AD. He wanted to know if AD was even in use in the year 800. In other words, he wanted to find out from scholars if they could tell him if AD was, had started to come into use before 800. So when he was able to see and evaluate the caliche layers at the discovery site, he took a lot of samples, and then he looked over the crosses also, and he noticed that there were mineralized growths also all over the artifacts that could have only grown in place undisturbed. And some of the carved out letters were filled in with some of these deposits that take hundreds of years to mineralize and develop, Scott had said. And some of these mineralized growths were malachite and azurite. And it was showing that these had been in the ground, undisturbed, for hundreds of years. It's the only way that this malachite and azurite could have grown to the degree that they grew in these carved out letters. Also, the evaluation of the caliche layer at the site, he had discovered that these relics, were buried below this layer, and it was determined that It takes hundreds of years for the caliche layer to develop that thick, and I believe it was around 5 feet thick of caliche. He also determined that the soil above the caliche layer did have sufficient limestone or calcium carbonate deposit in it so that when it rained and this limestone was absorbed into the water and percolated down, and it doesn't rain too much in the desert, but it did cement the artifacts into place over, a large scale of time. And obviously this caliche layer was super thick because it had not been disturbed for centuries. He also at this point had scholars tell him in reference to the dating that AD was in use by the year 800. So there was nothing fishy about that. So basically, he was able to say with modern science that, he was able to clear up the mystery, that they do appear to be genuine. And we know, of course, that history is not going to be rewritten. Even at this point, we know that the Vikings made it to Newfoundland before the year 1000 AD, but there's barely a blip about them in their accomplishments in the annals of history. So anything that contradicts Columbus first is pretty much rejected by history and scholars and academics. So what do you think about the Tucson Crosses or Tucson relics? Do you have any thoughts? You can let us know in the comments.